Today we're going to give an overview about open science and open science practices. The title is called Research Without Barriers, the Era of Open Science. Before I get started, I'd like to introduce the Open Science Officer of the Douglas Open Science Program, Isabel Basilar, who is here today and who will be available to answer any questions that you have at the end of the talk. So first, I just want to ask you all, what do you think about or what comes to mind when you think about open science? So you can enter answers on this Slido and they'll pop up right away. This is nice. So seeing things like transparency, data sharing, open access, sharing code, lots of different activities and principles of open science. So I wanted to highlight that we can think about open science in terms of what we can do and what it means. Essentially, what I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit the principles of open science, the values of open science, and then the final section of my talk will be talking about different open science practices and how you can incorporate them in your research. So before we start with that, I wanted to highlight some of the elements of research that have kind of fueled the open science movement over the past many years. So first is what is called the reproducibility crisis. So many of you may already be familiar with this, but many years ago there was a lot of work, especially in psychology, but also in other fields, showing that the results of published studies often do not replicate when you try to replicate them in a new study. And this calls into question the scientific integrity and credibility of research. So this led to a lot of crises and what is now called the reproducibility crisis, as I said, in psychology, but other fields. And it kind of led some people to wonder whether science was actually valid and whether the research findings that we're publishing and also trying to implement into clinical and other avenues are actually worth the work that's being put into them. So this is really negative, but there was a lot of positive that came out of it as well. And part of that was the open science movement. So there was a lot of changes, as you can see in the paper that I cited here, that talk about some of the changes that occurred in many different avenues as a response to this reproducibility crisis, including things like a focus on effect sizes, statistical power instead of just p-values, using additional samples in a single paper to replicate the work that you've done. We see this a lot in neuroscience. We saw this more so in other fields before, but it's coming more and more into the neuroscience, psychiatry, and psychology realms. And then also a greater transparency in research reporting. So for example, making your data or code openly available, which I'll talk about a little later. Another area in science that has kind of pushed the open science movement is this idea of publish or perish. So this idea is that you have to publish or else you're not going to be successful in research. And this is because publications are the primary metric for scientific impact. So because publications are the main metric, it led to this idea of publish or perish, where if you don't publish, you're not going to be impactful in your field. The problem with this idea about publications being the primary metric is that it promotes low quality research and questionable scientific practices. So people are going to prioritize quantity over quality and publish as many papers as they can instead of actually putting together a strong and methodologically rigorous paper that might have some impact in the world. So this mentality is still strong, and unfortunately publications are still the primary metric for impact, but there's a big movement to try to emphasize and appreciate other aspects of research that can also speak to scientific impact. So one of the major movements of this is the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA. DORA is basically an initiative and a set of principles that recommend different ways that you can assess research outputs. And this includes not focusing so much on the journal metrics like the impact factor, but looking at the actual impact of the research that was being reported. So we can put a link in the chat to show you a little bit more about, you can read a little bit more about DORA. And this declaration has been signed by the Douglas Research Center, as well as many other institutions like McGill, but also funding agencies like the Fonds de Recherche de Québec and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So this is something that the institutes, the funders are behind, and it's just a matter now of actually implementing and recognizing these non-traditional research outputs as impactful. The third element I wanted to touch on was what's called the ivory tower of academia. The idea here is that academia is an ivory tower where researchers stay in their tower and have no idea about what's going on around them. So it's a disconnect between the science that's being done and the society that it's supposed to be being done for. This disconnect reduces the impact of the scientific pursuits that are being followed, and it implies that there's little contribution from the lay community in the other direction as well. So some of the reasons that this ivory tower idea persists is because research publications are not available to the lay community because they're behind paywalls, or they're filled with jargon that makes it really difficult for someone without an advanced degree in the field to understand. And so this leads to a bit of an echo chamber where academics are really just kind of talking about their research with each other, and it doesn't really have much of an impact on society. So some of the ways that this idea is being kind of fought against is through knowledge exchange and science communication, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And this is basically trying to integrate individuals from the lay community into research, both in terms of communicating our research to them, but incorporating their input into the research itself. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about the principles and values of open science. So this is the UNESCO recommendation on open science, which has 4 pillars: open scientific knowledge, open science infrastructures, open engagement of societal actors, and open dialogue with other knowledge systems. And you can see how each of these is broken down as well. And you can feel free to look at the link to learn some more about these details. Essentially, this is highlighting different ways in which open science can be practiced and in which open science can have an impact on science and the community. So I won't go through all of these in detail, but these are the open science values and principles as put forth in UNESCO, and you can read about it as well on their website. So essentially the idea is that open science recognizes science as something that is of high quality and has integrity, bringing together knowledge and making the evaluation of science more transparent and accurate. So some of you did mention transparency as one of the elements that you think of when you think of open science, and that's really one of the core principles of open science. The idea is that open science is available, or science is available for everybody. It's going to have a collective benefit, and that this will lead to more equity and more diversity and inclusiveness in terms of scientific practices. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some examples of open science practices, or which open science practices have you heard of? Okay, we're seeing a lot of open access, sharing code, preprints. Open access is definitely one of the primary open science practices that has really gained, interest in the field. It's really the one that is really done the most often, and a lot of the funders are requiring open access publishing now. This is the one that you really kind of see popping up the most, but there are many, many other open science practices, as I can see now, including databanks, protocol papers, pre-registrations. Yes, participatory methods are included in open science practices, as I just mentioned. Getting individuals from the lay community or people with lived experience to participate in the development or design of the research is definitely incorporated in open science. So I'll talk now about some of the practices that we can consider part of open science. And what we really like as part of the Douglas Open Science program to emphasize here is that there are probably a lot of people doing open science practices that are not aware of it. So the open science practices can really cover the entire range of research, of the research cycle or life cycle. And so if we start in the top here in the blue, there are things like was already mentioned, pre-registrations and open proposals. I'll talk about each of these practices in a minute, but essentially these are just ways before you do your research to tell other people how you're going to do it and be transparent. And then co-design, similar or same kind of idea as participatory methods, which is integrating people that are outside of the research team into the research prior. Then you can have open science practices during the actual data collection and analysis stages through data and code sharing, for example, but there are many other practices as well. At the publication stage, things like preprints are becoming more and more popular with really large repositories that I'll touch on a little later, as well as open access publishing, which we already discussed. And then I think one of the areas that may have the least focus in open science, or the least link between open science and the practices itself, is at the level of knowledge mobilization. So knowledge mobilization has become kind of a practice all on its own, and it's a very large focus in a lot of different communities, and it also overlaps quite well with open science. So the idea here is that through conferences and any kinds of knowledge exchange, communications, you can share your research outputs with the lay community and really have an impact, have a broader impact of your research using open science. So I just have a final poll here, wondering what open science activities have you put into practice in your research? Pre-registrations, registered reports, co-design, secondary data use. Data sharing, I think I'll get to that in a second, but I'm not surprised it's so low. Code sharing is great. Open access publishing, of course, knowledge transfer, preprints. So I'm not surprised, given the people in the room here, that data sharing is so low. It can be quite a challenge as a trainee or as somebody who is an early career researcher to share your data. And there's a lot of hoops that sometimes you feel like you have to jump through. So what we're doing in the Douglas Open Science program is to try and improve data sharing or facilitate data sharing for the researchers and hopefully their trainees as well. It's great to see that there's so many open science practices already being practiced by this group. So I'm going to spend the next major portion of my talk focusing on different open science practices, what they mean and how they're done, and some different, I guess, opportunities or different ways that we can do it through platforms online or in other medias. So the first is pre-registrations and registered protocols. So as I mentioned, this is early on in the research stage. Early on in the research stage, so at the planning stage, before you've really started collecting your data, and definitely before you started analyzing your data. The idea here is what you're doing is just writing down or saying what you're going to do before you actually do it. And so this is the idea of transparency, and is allowing you to show others what your hypotheses are, what your planned analyses are. And so this allows you to have more transparency when you're doing your analysis. So this kind of fights the idea of what's called p-hacking, which is where some people will just do many different analyses and take the one that is significant. This kind of practice is really common in things like meta-analyses and clinical trials, but is not as common in more experimental research projects. We also see it more and more with other types of reviews, like scoping reviews and systematic analyses, which, if you're not familiar with the PRISMA protocol or guidelines, then you should definitely look at those for systematic reviews. There are also journal agreements, which is a very interesting topic. So some journals will allow you to submit a registered protocol or pre-registration, and more a registered protocol, and then you will basically, once it's approved, it will go through the review process, the registration itself, and then once it's approved through peer review, you would then have pretty much access to publish it or approval to publish it later, no matter what your results are. So the idea is that you're being assessed on your research plan rather than on whether the results work out or not. And the important thing about that is that it obviously it discourages p-hacking, it discourages not publishing non-significant findings. So that means that the papers that are coming out are going to be more truthful, and they're also going to include a broader range of results, because often the results that are not significant don't get published, though that is changing more and more in the past few years. So some different ways that you can pre-register your proposed project is through a database called Prospero. Prospero is a database for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and essentially you fill out a form, and you write in, what your research is going to be looking at, how you're going to do your analyses for your review, and then you submit that, and it gets reviewed and put up. This one is not related to a journal per se. It's really just what the standard is for putting up your pre-registrations for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. They don't accept all kinds of pre-registrations, and so what you will often see is for other kinds of systematic reviews, like a scoping review, we'll put our pre-registration up on other platforms like the Open Science Framework. The Open Science Framework is a really great kind of generalistic platform where you can upload code, data, you can put a pre-registration, and if you're not familiar with this already, I would highly recommend you take a look at it and see how it might be incorporated into your research. And then, as I said, there's journal publications where you can submit a registered protocol, and then they will, or a registered report is often what it's called, and then they will review that, and they might, and then you could publish it regardless of what your results say. Now, I mentioned co-design a little bit earlier. So co-design simply involves integrating the community in your research planning. So this as well is happening well before you're doing any analysis or data collection. In the context of the Douglas and our focus on psychiatry, usually this means incorporating people with lived experience of mental illness, but in general, it means incorporating anybody from the community. So this could be, the way that they can be involved can be quite broad. So it can involve people coming in with their own research questions and then pairing up as a partner with the researcher who would help them to essentially turn their research question into a research project. They could define the research question together through discussion, through perhaps some qualitative discussion or focus groups with a broader range of individuals from the community. And then there's more researcher-led co-design projects, which would involve the researcher coming up with the research question and asking people with lived experience who might be part of a council or a panel, for example, to provide comments and feedback on whether their research question follows what they might expect as someone with lived experience. So, for example, this could be reviewing the protocol or questionnaires to see if there's any language that might be stigmatizing or difficult to understand. This could also mean, giving feedback on whether the actual assessment protocol is feasible for participants and that kind of thing. So it can be very, very broad co-design, and really just depends on the relationship between the researcher and the person or the panel with lived experience. At the Douglas, we have quite a bit of experience and growing experience with co-design, and there are several researchers who integrate it quite well into their general research endeavors. We have at the CIUS, or the health center affiliated with the Douglas Research Center, a citizen partner office where you can go and get feedback on your work. Also, as part of the Center for Excellence in Youth Mental Health, there are advisory councils. This advisory council, there are several advisory councils, including youth, teens, and family members, moms and dads with children with experience with mental illness. And so what is possible is to basically consult with these advisory councils and have them provide feedback on your research protocol, essentially, and any other questions that you may have. Another aspect, once we get into actually doing the research, is sharing and reusing data. So this just simply means somehow providing access to data that exists already. This could be in the form of sharing your own data or reusing somebody else's data that they shared. I think it's really important to recognize, especially in the case of trainees, that it's not really possible for trainees to share their own data because they're not really the owner of that data. It's really the PI that would be the owner of the data. So trainees can get involved by reusing data that already exists and even potentially contributing back some of their derivative outputs or some of their analysis pipelines, so which I'll talk about in 1 second. So essentially, the challenge with data sharing is that often data is really complex and it does depend on the field. So in neuroimaging, data takes up a lot of space and it's very complicated. And so it needs a well-defined IT infrastructure in order to make that data sharing feasible and useful for people that want to have access to it. And this could be done easily over the internet. Data sharing can be of many different types. So it can involve restricted access, completely open access, or something in between. And this will all depend on the ethical considerations that are made when the data was collected in the first place. So data sharing can be kind of scary for some people because of the idea about privacy considerations, and also the idea of potentially having their work scooped. So I'm happy to chat a bit more about how open science can actually benefit research, publications, and data sharing and collaborations, rather than really impair a little bit those ideas about trying to get your research data out. But some people will wait until they've published a paper or two on their data set before sharing it as well. So in terms of ethical considerations, there are many, and it's a little much to get into today, but this is something that is usually discussed with the Research Ethics Board of the institution. When you submit for your research ethics application, you would say that you want to share the data. And then there would be potentially additional forms that need to be filled out and things like that. And sometimes if you want to do restricted data sharing, which means you want to approve every project that wants to take your data and use it, then you would design what's called a data access committee, and this could be a couple of the PIs and others involved in the research team who would review the proposed projects and approve or reject them or ask for modifications before providing access to the data. So there are many large-scale initiatives that trainees and others can get data for reuse. This includes things like the UK Biobank, which is provided at McGill through NeuroHub. There's also the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which is provided through the NIH, and ADNI as well. ADNI is for neurodegenerative disorders. All of these require some kind of approval, so you would kind of find the data and request access by filling out a form, essentially. And many of us in this group have done that already. At the Douglas, we've been working for the past few years to facilitate data sharing and also develop data banks that would be useful for people interested in using some of the data collected at the Douglas. The DNP, or Douglas Neuroinformatics Platform, has been really the front runner of this on the technological side. So they are developing a open data bank that will help to kind of organize all the data from the IT infrastructure side. And then some of the data banks that we've been putting together so far are the PEP data bank for early psychosis participants that come into to the Douglas. And then as part of our group as well, we also have the CRISP data bank that has been approved by the Research Ethics Board, and will incorporate the data from all of the PIs here essentially today. Then for code sharing and reuse, this is another aspect that can be done towards the end of data collection and analysis. And this is something that is very easy for anybody to do and is not done enough to my opinion, because it's something that is so important for the results that are coming out, and yet people are not sharing their code. So there's no transparency, and it's not clear whether things are being done properly. For anyone that codes here, you also know that the little things can lead to major changes in the results that are coming out. It's very fickle, coding is, so it's important to be transparent with your code. And I've had examples where I've shared code and people have found errors that have been fixed thanks to that. So these are ways that other people can contribute to your work as well by helping you potentially find issues with your code. So there's many different repositories where code can be uploaded online, and one of the major ones is GitHub. So if you don't have a GitHub account and you're doing any kind of analysis, even with things like, you don't have to be doing coding with the more complicated coding language. It could be like R, for example, or even SPSS syntax. There's no reason why you can't put your SPSS syntax up on GitHub. And this is the idea here, is to really be able to share the work that you've done already. And then there's also specific platforms that allow you to share pipelines and software related code. And so this includes things like the Canadian Open Neuroscience platform. We've been working on an experiments feature for this platform where the code underlying a digital cognitive assessment, for example, can be put up onto the Open Science framework, and then it gets linked to the Canadian Open Neuroscience platform. And so you can basically share your code through many different tools, and what's important is to make sure that you're being transparent and you're uploading the code that's being used. One thing I do want to touch on is that there is also the idea of versioning. So people who do software development are very familiar with this, but it might not be familiar to people outside the field. So the idea is anytime you make a change to the code on these platforms, it can see the changes that you made, and it will keep a record of all those changes that you made. And so you have different versions every time you make a change and upload it. And this is really helpful to see, if you went off track somewhere or something went wrong, or to roll back to code that was working properly. And so it's a really nice way to kind of keep track of your code even early on during the coding process. So you don't have to wait until your code is finalized to put it up. Now I'll get into the publishing side of things. So preprints, some of you are already familiar with this. The idea of preprints is really just to share your initial findings on your research project that you've been working on through analysis and data collection. Preprints are really just uploading, let's say, your Word document to an online server. And so it's very quick to do. It takes 5 minutes in the end to do it. You fill out a couple of parts of a form, and then you upload your Word document without needing to make any kind of typesetting or anything. And then it may go through an approval process, and then will be up onto the server. There are many different servers available, and the type of server depends on the type of research that's being done. So the most popular one is bioRxiv, but there are many others like PsycArchive, medRxiv, and others. So PsycArchive is paired with the Open Science Framework, and given our focus on psychiatry and psychology here, it's a really good option for most of the people at the Douglas, because it allows you to also pair with the Open Science Framework and a project in the Open Science Framework. So for example, you can put your supplementary materials in the project as well as any code or link to GitHub from there. It's really kind of a one-stop shop. Now, many of you are already familiar with open access publishing. This simply means sharing your peer-reviewed work. So preprints are happening before the peer review process. It can before the submission process as well, potentially. And then open access publishing really refers to after the peer-reviewed process. So once your publication has been peer-reviewed and accepted into a journal, it can be either closed or open. If it's open access, there are cost considerations. So for example, some journals will basically make your paper open access if you as the researcher pays a fee of something like $3,000 to $5,000 USD. So the cost considerations are very high, and this is something that can lead a lot of people away from open access publishing in traditional journals. But there are many other opportunities to contribute to open access publishing without paying for those fees. One of them is that universities often have agreements with different journals. So if you are affiliated with a university, you can potentially publish in that journal for free, and the journal will waive the fee because you're affiliated with that university. So essentially, when you go to select that you want to publish open access, they'll show you kind of how much it will cost, and then they'll show you like that it will be zero because they're waiving the fee. There are different kinds of open access using kind of a color pattern. So the open access where you would pay for it that I've been referring to is called gold open access. There's also diamond open access, which is the same thing except that there is no fee to pay. So these are journals that are kind of absorbing the cost of open access publishing and all of the other costs that go into publishing, like the editorial board and so on and so forth. So they're not putting the cost on the researcher or on the readers. And so these journals are really beneficial in that way for open science, but they're very few and far between. So you have to kind of find them and see if they would fit with your research project. There's also green open access, and what this refers to is that on the standard journals, when you don't choose gold open access, you choose a subscription model. So that means that people have to pay people would have to pay or have a university agreement to read your paper. After a certain period, an embargo period, this will become open access. So you can wait a year or more, and then the publication can be made open access. And we can use repositories like McGill eScholarship here at McGill to make our papers openly available following that embargo period. And now for some other interesting aspects that are often overlooked in terms of open science. We have open licenses. So when you publish a journal open access, you usually give a license to it to tell others how they can use your work. Because when you publish something or you make something available, it's always copyrighted automatically. So in order to tell other people how they're allowed to use your work, you have to add an additional license onto that, or you have to add a license onto that. And so for open science, you would use open licenses. And for the publication realm, this would really be a Creative Commons license. So you'll, in the bottom right of the corner, you'll often see this kind of licensing that will be attached to some presentations or even some publications. And this indicates that there's a Creative Commons open license that has been applied to the work, and that will tell you how you can use or reuse the work. I'm not going to go through all the different types of licenses, but the one in the bottom right, which is a CC by SA license, suggests or says that the work should be distributed while attributing it to the original author. So that's what the by is for. And then the SA is for share alike, so that if you're to share the work or any derivatives of the work, then you would also have to use the CC by SA license. So this is mainly for written works. There's also software licenses that are available for software. The reason why these are different is because the written works don't really cover a lot of the aspects of software that would really be needed in a proper license. So there's many other licenses that can be integrated into different softwares. And there's a very large open software movement in the world in general outside of science. And so there's a lot of licenses that are already available and have already been well established. And so these could be, for example, the MIT license or the GNU license as well. And these just define how people can use software specifically. So if you were sharing a software, you would use a software license. And if you were sharing a publication, you would choose a publication license. There are some considerations into which license you choose. So I have a couple of links here that would help you kind of guide you through choosing a license. In addition to the licenses that are listed under software license, there is another license that is kind of up and coming in the research field, and this is what's called the academic public license. This license basically says that people can reuse and distribute the work as much as they want, but they cannot share it, they cannot use it for any kind of financial gain or any kind of commercial uses. And so this can be really appealing to researchers who want to share their work but don't want that work to be made financially beneficial for the industry, for example. Most of the open software licenses typically accept commercial use. The reason for that is because the idea of kind of open source is that it should be open for everything, so even commercial use. And so this is something that I think on the academic side is a bit more challenging to kind of accept. And so I think that's why the academic public license has been gaining a little bit of popularity. So for persistent identifiers, these are just unique IDs that help people find you and link you with your work. So these are unique IDs that can be applied to institutions, individuals, facilities, and even research outputs. So you might have seen on any publications a DOI or digital object identifier. This is a persistent identifier, and this identifies your paper specifically using the DOI number that is assigned to it. DOIs can be applied to many different things, but they're not appropriate for certain things like individuals. So this is where the Open Researcher and Contributor ID, or ORCID, came in. ORCID is a persistent identifier that identifies you as a person, and you can basically link your outputs and everything with your ORCID ID. So it kind of serves as a CV as well. So if you don't have an ORCID, you should go to the website and get one if you have any works or publications that are relevant that you've published. And it can also be super useful if you are going to be changing your name, for example, or if you use just through errors, for example, you use a different name in different publications, like you're missing your middle initial in some publications. Sometimes that won't be caught, or people won't know that it's the same person. So putting them all under your ORCID ID can be really helpful to make sure that all of your work is linked to you properly. And because all of these unique identifiers, including identifiers for institutions and facilities that I won't get into right now, because they're all unique, you can link them all with each other. And so you can really start to get a picture of the individual who was involved with the work, the institution and facilities where the work took place, as well as some of the code, for example, that was linked to that work, and the digital object identifier of the publication. So you can really see all of these elements of the project linked together through persistent identifiers. And then I'll just end on practices with knowledge transfer. So as I talked a little bit about earlier, this is really just broadly sharing your findings. So it involves sharing your knowledge widely through many diverse channels with broad audiences. And it's just the idea of making the results of your work known outside of the general research team that was doing the work. So obviously publications count towards this. I just left them separate because there are a lot of practices that are relevant for that I wanted to get into. But there are other ways as well. So these are things like conferences that we have all gone to, but there are also more non-traditional avenues that I wanted to highlight. Things like presenting your work on social media, doing some of the different events at the Douglas, as well as the Viva Awards. And even some conferences have things like brain art events, like Organization for Human Brain Mapping has this every year. And so the idea, and then there's, the idea is basically to present your work in more of a visual milieu. And then, of course, there's more lay community events that can also contribute to the idea of knowledge transfer. So the impact of open science sometimes is hard to understand. So what we've been doing is working on a review with Kathy, who's in the call today, and Isabel, to understand the impact of open science on a very broad level. So a lot of the papers that you might find if you look today are how open access publishing improves citation count, for example, but then none of them really look at open science as a whole. So this was our goal with this review paper, which is currently in preparation. So what we found was that open science really improves visibility, as has been shown through many different papers already through open access publishing and other domains and other knowledge transfer activities, through citations and attention onto one's work. But it can have a specific impact on early career and low middle income country researchers. And so this can really be one way to improve their impact early on in their careers, or improve the impact of individuals who might have less resources. The open science can also improve sustainability by sharing data that can be analyzed for different purposes, sharing code that can be reused and improved upon. And so this really prevents us from having to reinvent the wheel or recollect a lot of really expensive data. It also leads to a higher credibility of the scientific findings, as I talked about at the beginning of this talk, due to transparency, and it makes scientific knowledge much more accessible to other researchers as well as to the lay community. And it improves collaboration and innovation opportunities, because once you're making your work open, other people can see it, and this can lead them to build collaborations with you. And finally, it emphasizes and facilitates more diverse and inclusive science, because it allows us to basically integrate perspectives from many different individuals through co-design, for example, and knowledge transfer activities, and also allows other people to grow their knowledge and contribute better to the research itself. So I just wanted to finish up by talking a little bit about open science at the Douglas. If you're not familiar, the Douglas has an open science program, which I am leading, along with Isabel Basilar, who's here today. We also, just in the past year or so, put together an open science training committee, which consists of individuals from the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute, which is one of the supporters of the open science program at the Douglas, along with the Douglas Foundation. And so we have essentially a trainee committee who helps us with our activities and who helps to guide the direction of the open science program at the Douglas. In 2021, we developed guiding principles and published in 2023 a position paper opening up mental health research. So I invite you all to read that paper if you haven't read it already. In the past year, what we've done is really looked at the open science program from kind of a bird's eye view and tried to understand our directions and our strategic plan. So we've developed short, medium, and long-term goals to build capacity in open science practices and provide community support in the short term, in the medium term to lead and support different open science initiatives that are already going on at the Douglas. And then in the long term, we wish to instill an open science culture at the Douglas with broad uptake of some of the open science practices I talked about today. And I wanted to highlight just on the bottom part of this slide some of the practices that we identified as being the most relevant practices for the Douglas and the ones that we will be focusing on as part of the open science program. Since I guess last fall, we've been developing an open science training series that was supported by the Tremplin Ambassador Award. And this is a monthly series of workshops and open science practices that are given by a diverse group of speakers. And what these different open science events help us do is to what we hope to do with that is to have trainees, research staff, and even PIs get a better understanding of the diverse research practices that promote open science, and learn more about OS-related career opportunities, as we're having speakers who are working in different areas, such as at the McGill Library or even in industry. And then we also aim to help trainees and others develop skills in these open science practices by highlighting some of the ways in which they can use these practices in their own work. So we're going to have all of these talks available on our YouTube channel of the Douglas Research Center. And finally, I just wanted to highlight the Douglas Open Science Awards. So this is the 3rd edition of the Douglas Open Science Awards, and what we are funding here is a project that you have an idea for example. So this is Science Awards for trainees, and the idea is that trainees would come up with a research project, and then they would propose this almost like a grant application, and then it would go through peer review, and the winners would be funded up to $5,000 per project, and would also receive a 1-year mentorship program from the Douglas Open Science program. So this has been going on for 3 editions. Now this is the 3rd edition essentially, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about what kind of projects can go in, but the idea is that anything that fits under the open science umbrella or buffet could fit within the Open Science Awards, and we highly encourage everybody to apply. It is not a very difficult application, it's a simple application, and we really want to see people and their open science ideas. Thank you very much.